Welcome to Sanctuary Stories, the podcast where we explore the incredible journeys of people seeking sanctuary and the remarkable contributions they've made to the world. I'm Phil, and in each episode we'll take you through the life of one extraordinary individual who defied the odds, overcame adversity, and left a lasting impact on society. And for our first episode, we're starting with one of the most instantly recognizable figures in history, Albert Einstein, a man whose name has become synonymous with intelligence, wild hair, slightly dishevelled, permanently looking as if he just remembered he'd left the oven on, but also one of the most influential thinkers of all time. But here's what people don't always talk about. Einstein wasn't just a scientist. He was a rebel, a refugee, and, if we're being completely honest, a little bit strange. He hated socks, he was terrible with addresses, and at one point he had to flee his own country because the Nazis wanted him unalived. Today, we're going to talk about how this violin-playing, school-hating, deeply unconventional genius went from a quiet childhood in Germany to changing the way we understand the universe. So settle in, grab a cup of tea. This is the story of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein was born on the 14th of March 1879 in Ulm, Germany. Now, most people assume that geniuses must be clever from the start, coming out of the womb solving algebra or reciting Shakespeare. Not Einstein. His parents were actually worried about him as a child. He was a very late talker, and when he did eventually speak at nearly 4 years old, his first words weren't exactly profound. He simply looked at his dinner one night and said, "The soup is too hot." Which, honestly, I respect. Some people just wait until they have something truly worthwhile to say. When asked why he hadn't spoken earlier, Einstein reportedly shrugged and said, "Because everything was fine until now." Fair enough. Despite this slow start, there were early signs that his mind worked a little differently when he was 5 years old. His father gave him a magnetic compass while he was ill in bed. And for little Albert, this wasn't just a toy, it was mind-blowing. The fact that the needle always pointed north, no matter which way he turned it, made him obsessed with understanding why. Something deeply hidden had to be behind things, he later wrote. That one tiny compass was enough to spark a lifetime of curiosity. Now, you'd think that someone like Einstein would have been a star pupil, but the reality was not quite. He absolutely hated school. Not because he wasn't clever. He was brilliant at maths and physics, but because the education system at the time was very rigid. Memorization, repetition, strict discipline, all things Einstein had no patience for. One of his teachers even told him, "You'll never amount to anything." Love that for them. Imagine saying that to Albert Einstein, of all people. At 15 years old, Einstein dropped out of school altogether, not because he was struggling, but because he found it boring. His family had moved to Italy, and instead of finishing school properly, he just didn't. Which, let's be honest, is a bold move, but it worked out for him. Eventually. After Einstein dropped out of school at 15, He had a bit of an unconventional path to success. He didn't waltz into the top university or land an amazing job in physics right away. In fact, for a while, it seemed like he might not have an academic career at all. At 16, Einstein tried to get into the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich, one of the best technical universities in Europe. He sat the entrance exam and failed it. The maths and physics sections? Fine, he aced those. But the other subjects, like languages and history, was an absolute disaster. He didn't get in. Which is kind of hilarious when you think about it. Einstein, one of the greatest minds of all time, failed to get into university because of his grades. But he didn't give up. Instead, he spent a year studying at a Swiss school in Aarau, brushing up on the subject that he was terrible at. A year later, in 1896, he reapplied and got in. Einstein started studying mathematics and physics at Zurich's Polytechnic School, but even here he had problems. He didn't struggle with the coursework, he just had no patience for the way universities worked. He ignored lectures he thought were boring, skipped classes he didn't respect, and spent most of his time reading physics textbooks on his own, rather than paying attention to his professors. Not ideal behaviour for a student. One of his professors, Heinrich Weber, was so frustrated with Einstein's arrogance that he famously told him, "You are a very clever boy, Einstein, but you have one great fault. You do not let yourself be taught." That professor later blocked Einstein from getting a university teaching job, which is why after graduating in 1900, Einstein had a physics degree, but no job prospects. His professors didn't like him, so no one was willing to write him a reference letter for a university position. For nearly 2 years, he drifted from one odd job to another, tutoring students and barely making ends meet. At one point, he considered giving up on physics altogether, and then, in 1902, he caught a lucky break. At 23, Einstein landed a job at the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. Now, was this a prestigious physics job? Absolutely not. His official title was Technical Expert Third Class, which basically meant he spent his days reviewing patents for inventions like electric circuits, typewriters, and mechanical devices. But here's the thing. This job was a blessing in disguise. It left him with plenty of free time. Once he got through the day's work, he could secretly do physics research on the side. It forced him to think clearly. Reviewing patent applications meant he had to explain complex concepts in simple, logical ways, something that would later help him communicate his own revolutionary ideas. It gave him financial stability. For the first time, Einstein wasn't worrying about money, so he could focus on his own scientific work in his spare time. So while other physicists were working in universities, Einstein was spending his evenings in his tiny apartment in Bern, filling notebooks with equations. And then came 1905. In what is now called Einstein's miracle year, he published 4 scientific papers that would reshape modern physics forever. The photoelectric effect proved that light behaves like particles, laying the groundwork for quantum mechanics, which, fun fact, he wasn't thrilled about. Brownian motion provided evidence for the existence of atoms and molecules, which some scientists at the time still weren't sure about. Special relativity introduced the idea that time and space are relative, meaning time moves differently depending on speed. E equals mc squared, the most famous equation of all time, proving that mass and energy are interchangeable, paving the way for nuclear energy. This would be an insane achievement for an entire career, let alone a single year. And let's not forget, he did all of this while working a 9-to-5 job at a patent office. It's as if someone working a desk job in insurance suddenly dropped 4 world-changing scientific discoveries on their lunch break. At first, Einstein's papers were largely ignored by the scientific community. But then, in 1906, a famous German physicist, Max Planck, one of the biggest names in physics at the time, read Einstein's work and realised it was groundbreaking. Suddenly, universities that had ignored Einstein for years were desperate to hire him. By 1909, he was offered his first academic position at the University of Zurich. By 1915, he was developing general relativity, his next big theory. And the rest? History. Now, Einstein was brilliant at physics, but relationships? Not so much. His first wife, Mileva Malik, Einstein married Mileva Malik in 1903, back when he was still a struggling physicist. Mileva was brilliant in her own right, one of the first women to study physics in Switzerland. Some historians even believe that she may have helped Einstein with his early work, though that's still debated. But their marriage was a disaster. Einstein was emotionally distant, completely consumed by his work, and let's be honest, not the most supportive husband. In 1914, he wrote a horrific list of rules for Mileva, basically turning their marriage into a contract. It included conditions like she must expect no affection from him, she must stop talking to him if he requested it, and she must leave the room immediately when told to do so. Lovely. Needless to say, the marriage fell apart and they divorced in 1919. A few months later, Einstein married his cousin Elsa Einstein. Yes, cousin. Unlike Mileva, Elsa wasn't a physicist. She was practical, patient, and knew how to manage Einstein's absent-minded chaos. She basically took the role of his caretaker, making sure he ate, dressed, and didn't wander off into the traffic while thinking about relativity. Einstein adored Elsa, but he wasn't exactly faithful. He had several affairs, and he was quite open about it. At one point, he even listed the names of his mistresses in a letter to Elsa, which, honestly, is just a baffling move. Einstein had 3 children, but his relationships with them were just as complicated as his marriages. Liesel Einstein was born in 1902 and was the mystery child. Liesel was Einstein and Mileva's first daughter, but she completely vanished from historical records. Some historians believe she died in infancy, others think she was given up for adoption. Hans Albert Einstein, born 1904. Their eldest son, Hans Albert, became an engineer and moved to the United States. Unlike his father, he had a much more stable personal life. Edward Einstein. Edward was Einstein's youngest son, was brilliant, but struggled with mental illness. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent most of his life in psychiatric institutions. Einstein was heartbroken over Edward's condition and once said, "Perhaps if I'd been a better father, he would have been a different person." Einstein wasn't just a scientific genius. He was also a political activist and a fierce critic of oppression, fascism, and militarism. He didn't just sit in a lab solving equations. He was deeply engaged in world affairs, using his influence to advocate for peace, human rights, and refugees, including people fleeing the same fate he once escaped. Einstein's political beliefs were progressive, anti-authoritarian, and deeply rooted in his own experiences. He had a lifelong hatred of nationalism, probably because he saw firsthand what it could lead to. Long before Hitler came to power, Einstein saw what was coming. Even in the early 1920s, he was publicly warning about the dangers of rising German nationalism and militarism. He wasn't just worried about war. He knew that Jewish people, intellectuals, and political dissidents were being scapegoated. Einstein openly called the Nazi ideology an epidemic of insanity, and as long as I have any choice, I will only stay in a country where civil rights prevail, tolerance is practiced, and the individual does not risk being sacrificed for the mass. Needless to say, this did not go down well with the Nazis. By the late 1920s, Einstein had become a major target of far-right German groups, including Hitler's supporters. By the early 1930s, Nazi newspapers were literally running front-page stories calling for Einstein's unalivement. One German newspaper, the Völkischer Beobachter, which was essentially the Nazi propaganda machine, called Einstein a traitor and a dangerous Jew. In 1933, a Nazi magazine called The Black Book published an actual list of people that they wanted to unalive, and Einstein's name was on it. They even put a bounty on his head for 5,000 Reichsmarks, which was a huge sum at the time. Around this time, German fascists were openly calling for Einstein's assassination. The Nazi regime had a growing obsession with cleansing German science of Jewish and leftist influences, and Einstein was their number one enemy in that regard. By 1933, Nazi book burnings had begun across Germany. The famous images of bonfires filled with books, many of those were written by Albert Einstein. His work was seen as a threat, both because he was Jewish and because his theories contradicted Nazi ideology. At one of these burnings, a Nazi official announced to the crowd, "The soul of the German people can now express itself once again. The most dangerous Jew of them all, Einstein, has been exorcised." By the time Hitler officially took power in 1933, Einstein knew he had to leave Germany for good. The timing was crucial because Einstein wasn't actually in Germany when Hitler became Chancellor. He had been travelling in the United States giving a series of lectures at American universities. And then, in March 1933, Einstein received news that confirmed his worst fears. His home in Germany had been raided by the Nazis. All his personal bank account was seized. Nazi officials announced he would never be allowed to return, and there were credible death threats against him. Einstein had two options: go back to Germany and risk arrest, or worse, or leave forever. He chose the latter. In a dramatic move, Einstein immediately resigned from his job at the Prussian Academy of Sciences, an act that made headlines worldwide. He sent an official letter simply stating, "I shall live in a country where civil liberty, tolerance, and equality of all citizens before the law prevail. These conditions do not exist in Germany at present." Shortly after, he travelled to Belgium, where he officially renounced his German citizenship. Einstein, who had been born in Germany and lived there for most of his life, became stateless once again. It wasn't the first time he'd done this either. Einstein had renounced his German citizenship once before as a teenager because he hated the country's militarism. But this time, the stakes were much higher. After months of staying in Europe under the radar, Einstein was offered a safe place in the United States. He accepted a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, which would become his home for the rest of his life. But he wasn't just thinking about himself. Einstein spent a huge amount of time and effort helping other Jewish refugees escape Nazi persecution. He personally helped Jewish scientists flee Germany, writing hundreds of letters of recommendation to universities and research institutions worldwide, urging them to hire Jewish academics before the Nazis could imprison them. He later described the Nazi regime as a cult of violence and a grave threat to civilization. And when World War II finally broke out, Einstein co-signed a historic letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning the Nazis might be trying to build an atomic bomb. That letter eventually led to the Manhattan Project, which developed the first nuclear weapons. Einstein himself was horrified that his work had contributed to atomic bombs being used, and he spent the rest of his life campaigning for nuclear disarmament. Now, beyond being a scientific genius and a refugee, Einstein was also an absolute character. He had that perfect mix of brilliant and slightly chaotic that makes someone endlessly fascinating. If he were around today, I'm fairly sure he'd be that friend who forgets their keys 3 times a week, never has their phone charged, and turns up to important meetings wearing odd socks. Let's go through some of the highlights. One of Einstein's most famous quirks was his absolute refusal to wear socks. Now, most of us has probably walked around the house barefoot once or twice, but Einstein took this to a philosophical level. He once said, "When I was young, I found out that the big toe always ends up making a hole in a sock, so I stopped wearing socks." Which is one solution, I suppose. Most of us just buy new socks, but sure, revolutionizing physics and dodging sock-based inconveniences, he was a man of efficiency. This wasn't just a home habit either. Einstein famously didn't wear socks anywhere, to lectures, to meetings, to dinner parties, to the White House. In fact, there's a photograph of him meeting President Franklin D. Roosevelt, dressed in a smart suit, but very much sockless in his sandals. Bold move. At one point, he even wrote a letter to his wife, Elsa, casually mentioning that he'd stopped wearing socks altogether, as if that was the most normal thing in the world. For someone who redefined our understanding of the universe, Einstein was shockingly absent-minded in everyday life. Once, after moving to Princeton, he took a taxi home but then forgot his own address. He had to ask the driver if they knew where Albert Einstein lived. Luckily, the driver recognized him and drove him home. Otherwise, who knows where he would have ended up. His second wife, Elsa, once said, "One of my chief duties as his wife is to protect him from himself." Honestly, it sounds like a full-time job. He would lose things constantly, including his keys, his notebooks, and even his train tickets. Luckily, the train conductors knew who he was and would just wave him through. Imagine being so famous that you don't even need a ticket anymore. At one point, he absent-mindedly signed a check for a delivery boy that was worth far more than the actual bill. When the boy pointed it out, Einstein simply shrugged and told him to keep it. It's almost like Einstein had so many thoughts in his head about the universe that the smaller details like socks, addresses, and financial transactions just didn't make the cut. If you picture Einstein working on a groundbreaking theory, you probably imagine him surrounded by blackboards filled with equations deep in thought. And while that was part of it, the reality was often very different, because when Einstein got stuck on a scientific problem, he wouldn't just sit there thinking, he'd grab his violin and start playing. Music wasn't just a hobby for him, it was almost a second language. Once he said, "If I were not a physicist, I would probably be a musician." His violin was called Lena, and he took it everywhere. He would play at home, in the garden, during dinner parties, and even between scientific discussions with other physicists. If he was deep in thought and struggling with an idea, he'd start playing Bach or Mozart. It was as if music helped his brain process complex physics problems. And sometimes in the middle of playing, he would suddenly stop and shout, "I've got it!" and rush off to scribble down a breakthrough theory. I can only assume this was slightly irritating if you were just trying to enjoy the music. In 1952, Israel's Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion and Ambassador Albert Einstein formally offered Einstein the role of President of Israel. Einstein, honoured but realistic, declined, stating, "I am deeply moved by the offer from our State of Israel, and at once saddened and ashamed that I cannot accept it. All my life I have dealt with objective matters. Hence, I lack both the natural aptitude and experience to deal properly with people and to exercise official functions." Upon hearing Einstein's refusal, Ben-Gurion sighed and reportedly said, "Tell me, who is this Einstein? Is he crazy?" By the time Einstein turned down the presidency of Israel in 1952, he was already in his 70s and had settled into a quieter life in Princeton, New Jersey. He never retired. He kept working on physics until the very end, but he had also shifted his focus. He became passionate advocate for nuclear disarmament, speaking out against the very atomic weapons his work helped create. He supported civil rights in the US, publicly opposing racism and segregation. And he continued writing letters to world leaders, offering advice on science, politics, and peace. But Einstein also knew he was nearing the end of his life. On April 17, 1955, Einstein suffered an abnormal aortic aneurysm, a rupture in his heart's main artery. Doctors offered to operate, but Einstein refused. "I want to go when I want to go," he said. "It's tasteless to prolong life artificially. I have done my share. It is time to go. I will do it elegantly." He died the next morning on the 18th of April, 1955, at the age of 76. And then, because nothing in Einstein's life was ever normal, his brain was stolen. Yes, you heard that right. After Einstein's death, Dr. Thomas Stoltz Harvey, the pathologist who performed the autopsy, secretly took Einstein's brain without permission. He later chopped it into 240 pieces and spent the next 40 years carrying it around in jars, occasionally sending it to researchers. At one point, he kept pieces of Einstein's brain in his basement in Tupperware containers. It wasn't until the 1990s that Einstein's brain was finally returned to Princeton, where it remained preserved in slices to this day. Einstein himself would have hated this. He explicitly requested to be cremated, as his ashes scattered in secret to avoid creating a shrine. Instead, his brain was treated like a bizarre science project for decades. Even in death, Einstein remained an enigma. He was one of the greatest scientific minds in history, but he was also deeply flawed, eccentric, and unconventional. He changed the way we understand the universe, from relativity to quantum mechanics. He was a refugee who stood against tyranny, helping others escape persecution. He was a political activist fighting against war, nuclear weapons, and racism. He was a man who rejected authority, who thought differently, and who never stopped asking questions. At the heart of it all, he never took himself too seriously. His tombstone doesn't read greatest physicist of all time or Nobel Prize winner. Instead, Einstein himself once said, "I have no special talents, I am only passionately curious." And in the end, that curiosity changed the world. That's it for our first episode of Sanctuary Stories. Next week, we're talking about Freddie Mercury, a refugee, a rock legend, and an icon. You won't want to miss it. See you then. I would like to give a huge thank you to Soulful Jam Tracks for the music. You can find all the artist credits, references, and resources in the episode description. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe and share it. It really helps. And if you have a moment, leave a review. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep striving, keep thriving.